This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Rachel Carson is often remembered as the author of Silent Spring. That groundbreaking 1962 book warned about the environmental dangers of pesticides. Today, she's celebrated as a pioneering environmentalist. But during her lifetime, she was faced with lots of intense criticism. Chemical companies, industry groups, and some scientists argue her warnings were overblown. Now, the Beinecke Library at Yale is examining Carson's life and work through a new exhibit. It's one that revisits both her achievements and the controversy surrounding them, and also the implications for our environment today in 2026. Joining me now are two of the minds behind the exhibit, Carla Baditz, librarian for literature in English and comparative literature at the Yale Library. Carla, thanks for being on the show today.
Thank you as well, Catherine. It's nice to meet you.
And James Kasanides, who's the Kaplanoff Librarian for American History, also at the Yale Library. James, appreciate you being here as well.
Thank you, Catherine. So nice to be here.
And Carla, so tell me about how the idea for the exhibit centering the life and work of Rachel Carson came to be, and why did Beinecke decide that now was the right time to spotlight her?
So there's a long answer and a short answer to that question. And the kind of longer answer, which I will try to keep short, is that I personally had been thinking about Carson for a long time. I was sort of introduced to her work in elementary school and was interested sort of all along. And then after I finished graduate school, I spent 2 years teaching in the Middle East and started to think more carefully about sort of environmental concerns and about the struggle over water rights and overfishing in the Mediterranean, waste disposal, all of those things. And I started reading Carson again, and she was a voice that I was drawn to. And she helped me see those landscapes in any way and think about those landscapes in any way and helped me understand the kind of ways in which we could address some of those concerns, even as individuals. And I think in terms of why Rachel Carson now and why this Beinecke exhibit now, this is it's an important moment to sort of reevaluate her career, her life, the work that she produced. The Beinecke holds the Rachel Carson Papers, which is a collection that over the past couple of years has been receiving more and more use. Research has come from all over the world to use this collection. It's one of Beinecke's largest collections, over 100 boxes. And it's been getting so much use and so much attention has recently come to the work of Carson that we thought this was the right moment to sort of think about what that collection is and what it's doing here and the ways in which it can help us think about the environment today.
That's a great long, short answer. Well done, Carla.
Thank you. Yeah.
And then we'll get into more about Rachel Carson as her person and what her work entailed. But James, I would love for you to tell us first a bit more about the vision for this exhibit. What story arc were you trying to tell in its arrangement?
Sure, Catherine. Our vision was to try and hit some of the already known highlights of Carson's life and career, but at the same time, to try to focus in various moments throughout the exhibit on things that might be less known or little known. We didn't want to do a straightforward biography that has been already kind of canonized in so much of the extensive literature on Carson. And we were benefited in a real way by the actual layout of the display cases on the mezzanine level of the Beinecke, which in essence consist of 9 standing cases on one side of the building and 9 standing cases on the other side of the building. So this allowed us to adopt a kind of vignette style approach. Each case can be approached as a standalone. And of course, you never quite know where a visitor to the library is going to actually end up. Our intention is certainly that we have a starting point that begins chronologically in Carson's early life and proceeds around the floor of the display cases, ultimately until the end, when we have a case covering her death and some developments after she has passed away. But we wanted to try and use this vignette style approach to hit on aspects of her life and contribution that we thought had been neglected or that surprised us as we were doing our research in the archive. So it's broadly linear and chronological, but hopefully will provide a number of new pieces of information and discoveries for visitors to the Beinecke.
Well, I definitely want to talk more about what were the aspects that surprised you all when you were putting together this exhibit. But before we do that, Carla, I want to talk about her notable work that we mentioned earlier, Silent Spring, especially for listeners who may not be familiar. Can you tell us what this book was about?
Yeah, so Carson publishes Silent Spring in 1962. It's, the late 50s and kind of the early 60s are this era of new affluence and intense, maybe social conformity in the United States. There's the kind of Cold War climate. There's this atmosphere of suspicion. And the chemical industry, too, is really getting going right after the war. It's one of the chief kind of benefactors of post-war technology. And it's held up as a kind of hero of the nation's prosperity post-war. And Carson sort of, is writing at this time. She's a woman. She's in the field of biology, which compared to chemistry and physics is considered somehow in the period to be lesser. She's not. She doesn't have academic affiliation. She doesn't have any institutional affiliation. She's also writing for the public. So she, at this time, is best known as an author of books about the sea, as a kind of nature writer. Carson had become sort of interested throughout her career in what was happening, even in places like her hometown in Springdale, Pennsylvania, in terms of the kind of growth of the steel and iron industry and the pollution of the Allegheny River. And she writes about this all along. And then in the 1950s, she receives, there are a number of things happen. Becomes interested in the problem of DDT and tries to pitch something to the Reader's Digest on DDT. And the Reader's Digest is not interested. But she is interested in the sort of idea of a nuclear fallout. She's also interested in the problem of pesticides and in the way in which those things are sort of comparable or can be compared. And she essentially becomes interested in a number of things. For example, she's in correspondence with Marjorie Spock, the sister of Benjamin Spock, the pediatrician, and Marjorie Spock and her partner Mary Richards are in the first kind of mass environmental litigation lawsuit with the United States government over spraying of DDT over their organic farm in Long Island. And they invite Carson to participate in this trial or to join as a plaintiff. She refuses, but she strikes up a correspondence with Marjorie Spock and follows this lawsuit, which Spock and her partner lose eventually, and they have to pay over $100,000 in damages to the government. She also corresponds with readers who sort of send her, like Olga Hutchins, who was a woman in Massachusetts, who sent her letters about the disappearing songbirds in their gardens. And the problem of DDT just sort of comes back and comes back. And eventually she decides she's going to pitch an article to the New Yorker. She had been writing for the New Yorker all along. And it becomes too big to be a New Yorker piece. It becomes a book.
Well, you mentioned DDT a couple of times. Is it a pesticide, and how was it being used?
Yeah, so it is a pesticide. During the war, it was actually being used to prevent lice, and it was, and it was being sort of sprayed. In Italy, for example, there was a kind of spraying campaign where sort of the local population was, DDT was being used essentially to prevent lice, as well as in the kind of, in the U.S. Armed Forces as well. But it is being sort of used after the war. She's interested broadly in kind of chlorinated hydrocarbons, and she's also interested broadly in the way in which DDT sort of specifically as a kind of is being used to suppress the insect population, but also has these kind of other effects chlorinated hydrocarbons do, or like phosphorus insecticides do. And so much of Silent Spring is sort of devoted to this question of how those specific substances, chemical substances, work, and how they affect not just the insect population, but then the food chain itself.
Well, and of course, during this time, it may not be so far away from us historically, but all of this, the concept was new. James, how controversial were some of the claims Carson made at this time, and what were some of the claims that she made?
Well, her primary claim in Silent Spring is that the use of DDT, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, was indiscriminate. So she was very careful in responding to her critics to say that she never wanted to propose a program of responding to pests entirely without the use of chemicals. But she felt that the spraying campaigns, and we should note that in particular, these were aerial spraying campaigns.
Yes.
So they were at a scale that was quite concerning to her. And she felt that that was something that needed to be reined in and moderated. And as Carla mentioned a moment ago, in Silent Spring, and we should say that the publication of Silent Spring is itself an event. We can
Yeah.
talk a little bit more about that, but she's already established as a successful writer 10 years earlier, which really sets up a whole, not only continuity in her own thinking and writing and what she's concerned about, but it sets the stage for a whole public debate and airing once the articles start appearing in the New Yorker in the summer of 62, and then once the book itself is brought out in book form in late September of 62. Controversial, I mean, certainly both then and since there have been critics. At the time, the industrial response is quite vicious in attacking her in overtly sexist and misogynistic ways. She has support at very high levels by the same token, including that of the Kennedy administration. And ultimately, one can get a sense of the controversy at the time. And we try to share a little bit of this in the exhibit by fast forwarding several months from the publication of the book when she goes on what was at the time a very well known radio program, CBS Reports, hosted by the journalist Eric Severide, which is kind of set up as a one-on-one debate. And she's allowed to, she appears on screen. You hear her, you see her. She's quite ill, suffering from metastasized breast cancer at this point in her life. And she's counterposed with chemists from industry who are opposing her claims and saying they're baseless. But certainly within 10 years, the United States bans DDT. There's a lot more that we could say about both the domestic and the international fallout, so to say, of the book. But it definitely spurs a massive public debate as soon as even the articles start appearing in the New Yorker that summer.
Well, and Carla, I'm curious to hear about how it sounds like a lot of people who had a stake in it were against her sort of warnings. But what about how the general public received that information? How were her warnings about the chemical DDT received by just people in general and perhaps the scientific community?
Yeah, so I think the public was very receptive. She received hundreds of fan letters, many of which are still held in the collection. And they're very interesting to read. She tried to respond to much of the correspondence as much as she could. And she was sort of idolized in the popular culture. Charles Schulz did a series of Peanuts cartoons on Rachel Carson, which we feature in the exhibit. And more generally, you can see the kind of response in the many comic strips at the time. And it's really interesting we thought about that in relation to gender, because many of the comic strips that depict Carson or that talk about Carson feature women and children. And those are very positive. And then there are comic strips that sort of feature kind of male protagonists, and they are sort of more skeptical or more negative. So there is something very interesting sort of going on there. There were also responses in magazines. Even the sort of the chemical industry responded in magazines. Monsanto Chemical Company, for example, had a series of responses to Carson. One of which essentially, we also feature this in the exhibit, mocked her by sort of using the language of Silent Spring, and it's called How to Answer Rachel Carson, and it provides a kind of step-by-step list of sort of talking points for a member of the public, for someone who would just want to sort of refute her claims. She was also, she was called the kind of bird and bunny lover. She received attacks in terms of, she was called a woman who kept cats, and the kind of romantic spinster. The industry went as far as kind of spending $250,000 sort of refuting her claims in kind of both in specialized publications and then more broadly. Um, but the public was very receptive, and the book sort of had a kind of mass following from the beginning. There, and it helped also that she was published in the New Yorker, as always. That kind of serialization of the first couple of chapters of Silent Spring in the summer sort of really anticipated the book and launched some of those conversations and some of those debates.
Well, and then talking about debates, and Carla mentioned it just now, but James, you also mentioned it earlier in terms of the debates with between Carson and industry leaders, and Carson with TV talk show hosts and all of that. I'm wondering if your preparation for this exhibit, if you were thinking about any of the parallels between the public debates that happened then versus today's environmental debates.
Yes. And it was
Yeah.
hard not to. I mean, we
Yeah.
spent nearly two
Yes.
years putting together this exhibit. And to me, at least, it seemed that I won't say every day, but certainly every week or every couple of weeks, quite frequently, just doing my normal check-in of the news every morning, there were things that immediately put me back in mind of Rachel Carson, of her work generally, of Silent Spring specifically, of the response, and then the kind of mobilization that went along with that response on both sides. And there are so many parallels, I think, on down to today and to our current moment. Uh, I'll pause there, but certainly, yes. And I think part of what we hope viewers will take away is the way in which Carson anticipated much of what we still debate, and in other ways, with things that she would have had no way of even conceiving, how nonetheless her story is one that is a very valuable, we think, reference point for today.
And Carla, we'll hear more about Rachel herself and her writing a little bit later on the show, but curious to hear if you feel like Rachel Carson had a unique way of communicating these really complex scientific concepts to a general audience.
Yeah, so she started her undergraduate career at what is now Chatham University, was the Pennsylvania College for Women, and she majored in English. And she was a big reader. She read everything from, John Milton, to like John Ruskin, to contemporary writers. She was really interested in all kinds of things, and spent much of her first and second year in college sort of doing creative writing and writing college themes on different topics. And eventually she decided to major in biology after she met a very charismatic professor called Mary Skinker, who was a kind of zoology professor at Pennsylvania College for Women, and she switched her major. But in the first kind of half of her career, she sort of really discovered her writer's voice. And in writing the Sea trilogy, her first three books about the sea, she came back to writing. She says a number of times that she had sort of put that away, and that she thought she couldn't possibly do both things, or that somehow she had to trade writing for a career in science. And in part due to financial instability and the kind of and financial pressures, she began to publish her work. Her first job was at the U.S. Bureau for Fisheries, and actually she was writing radio script, and she was hired by Elgar Higgins, who was then the head of the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, to essentially produce what he called 7-minute fish tales, which were public writing about the sea, about marine life, for the radio. And it was the series that the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, that became the U.S. Bureau of Fish and Wildlife Service, was putting together for the public. And she took over that, and she was so successful in kind of cultivating that public voice and that kind of writing for the public, that she eventually became head of publications at the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries. And also too, because she was trying to have additional income, she started sending articles off to places like the Baltimore Sun. and she continued writing for the newspapers, and eventually her first sort of long essay was published in 1937 in the Atlantic. It was called Undersea, and originally had been a government publication, but Higgins, her boss, had sort of said, like, this is too literary for us to sort of to it can't be it can't be a government brochure or a pamphlet. It has to be something else. And then she eventually she transitioned to writing full time, and writing about nature and about the oceans, sort of as a writer. And that decade is really interesting in terms of her kind of figuring that out and figuring out how she can do both of those things and how they're not unrelated.
It's amazing to hear the sort of marrying the idea of science and English and writing together, which we love talking about in this space. And we'll hear more about her life and her process after a quick break. We're talking about environmentalist Rachel Carson and her legacy today. Carson is the author of Silent Spring, a groundbreaking work that changed how Americans think through the unintended consequences of technological progress. After the break, our conversation continues. This is Where We Live. Stick with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Connecticut is home to one of the world's largest buildings entirely dedicated to rare books and manuscripts. The Beinecke Library is located at Yale University, and their current exhibit, open to visitors now, tells the story of Rachel Carson, a pioneering environmentalist. Her groundbreaking book, Silent Spring, sounded the alarm on a synthetic pesticide called DDT. It was commonly used during the World War II to kill insects carrying malaria, typhus, body lice, and more. We're joined this hour by the curators of the exhibit, which weaves together the story of Carson's life. We have Carla Baditz, who's the librarian for literature in English and comparative literature, also curator for Beinecke Library's exhibition, Silent Springs. Carla, appreciate your time. And also James Casanides, who's the Kaplanoff librarian for American history, also at Yale Library. So, James, we've been talking a lot about Rachel Carson's work and her life and just a lot of the things that she's experienced. I want to bring it back to the exhibit. Can you highlight one or two of the most striking items or surprising items that are featured there for you?
Sure, Catherine. One or two that occur to me immediately. One actually concerns Carson's work from before Silent Spring. We've alluded to it so far, but I'll say just a little bit more about it. And that is her 1951 book called The Sea Around Us, for which she won the National Book Award in 1952, and the success of which did permit her to leave her job at what was originally the U.S. Bureau of Fisheries, the Fish and Wildlife Service, and to become a full-time writer, and also to build a home in Maine and work on the third book of what would end up being called her Sea Trilogy. And then also that sets her up to continue with the connections necessary to publish Silent Spring several years later. But what we found in revisiting The Sea Around Us, and it's a beautiful book and there is so much you could say about it, but in particular, we highlight a number of things about it, but in particular, in one moment in the exhibit, in one case in the exhibit, we returned to a chapter that she wrote in that book called The Global Thermostat, by which she was referring to the ocean and the role of the oceans in what was occurring to her and to many others at the time as being the warming temperatures of the world. It's a chapter in which she talks about the melting glaciers, and she speculates as to what the cause may be. It's a little bit more involved than that, and in our exhibit, we have a reproduction of some of her research notes for that chapter. It was actually a chapter that Vogue magazine ran 2 months before the book was published. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of not propose that Carson was a climate scientist in the way of the climate science of the last couple of generations, which has recognized the role of greenhouse gases in global warming, but nevertheless, she was raising a question that was true, and many others, both scientists and popular authors, were doing this as well. And that was it was 1950 and they were observing a warming trend and they were wondering what's behind it. We had a lot of fun with that, although it's a very serious issue. We also hoped to raise that way. And then I'll just add that another thing that personally stayed with me from Silent Spring is Carson's work with her illustrators, Lois and Louis Darling, who were a married couple. And she was quite meticulous in everything, including her research, her writing, and even her correspondence and guidance to them about the role that she wanted the visuals to play in the book. And we ended up settling on a fantastic image. Carson herself referred to it at one point as a pretty image of insects that the Darlings did, and it's become a kind of visual theme of our entire exhibit. And it was there because of one of the most important arguments Carson had wanted to convey through Silent Spring, which is that the indiscriminate aerial spraying of DDT was creating an ecology in which insects had developed resistance to DDT. So the entire purpose was defeated by virtue of, as she and her editor had put it at one point leading up to publication, by the emergence of what they called the insects, quote, fighting back. And so it's just another one of those moments that we kind of felt was a little bit under the radar with Carson and that we wanted to spotlight in a particular display. There's a lot more than that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, we certainly are also firm believers of having some fun despite talking about serious topics. Gives a little different perspective there. So appreciate that, James. And sort of following along the same thought, Carla, since you've had a chance to go through a lot of Carson's letters and personal papers to put on display or not, curious to hear, what did you learn about her from her writings, and what do they reveal about her thinking? Because we know her as, the environmentalist and the author of Silent Spring, but I imagine the letters reveal a little bit more.
Yeah, so there are Carson kept notebooks throughout her life, and it's really interesting to sort of see them in the collection. She was a very private person, so actually we don't know that some of the writing that she did privately, some of the notebooks actually are not even in the collection. A number of papers were destroyed upon her death. Both she knew that she was dying in the early 60s, and sort of destroyed a lot of that. And then after her death, her brother Robert did as well. But from what is there, the notebooks sort of show her thinking about the natural world in a really interesting way. And she kept detailed field notes. She would go out in the mornings when the tide was low, and then again in the evenings, and sort of go tide pooling. And you can sort of follow her thought processes, and the ways in which she would focus in on a kind of in the particular animal and sort of follow a kind of non-human perspective. And in all of her notebooks, and then in the first book in the Sea Trilogy, 1941, Under the Sea Wind, she sort of does this. She thinks from a kind of about the non-human world in a non-human way. And the writing is extraordinarily beautiful. She was a lyrical writer, and it's poetic. She wrote a lot of poetry herself. She tried to become a poet in her early 20s. That didn't work. She kept all of the rejection slips, but she sort of folded the poetry into her writing about the oceans, and then even into the writing of Silent Spring. And you see that in the unpublished drafts. You see her sort of working out the bon mot, the exact correct way of saying what she wanted to say, finding that perfect word. And she revised her drafts over and over again, and had her mother read them over and read them out loud to her, and it sort of kept revising until she was happy with what she had written. And the notebooks really reveal that, and they reveal a kind of private Carson. So do the letters. She had a very active correspondence. She corresponded with everyone. That's one of the ways in which she did her research, was through corresponding with scientists, with government agencies, with the public. She wrote to everyone, and everyone wrote to her. And there is also a kind of set of private letters. She and her neighbor on Southport Island, Dorothy Freeman, became very close, and exchanged letters from the kind of early 50s until Carson's death. And that collection collection. Part of those letters were published in this collection edited by Martha Freeman called Always Rachel. And you can really see the private Carson in those letters. She talks about her cats. She talks about her binoculars. She talks about how she likes to go out, in the mornings in Maine. She talks about how frustrating it is to be a public figure, and how she didn't like being in the spotlight, and how people would sort of see her as this kind of monumental figure, as someone who was doing something really important for the environment, but didn't always see how difficult that was, or how she sometimes struggled to sort of to be a private individual at the same time.
Well, it's always wonderful to sort of have these reminders that they are just human beings after all, and they struggle as well. And I think we always appreciate when writers get rejection letters because you're like, that's inspiring.
Yes.
And James, as Carla just shared with us, Rachel Carson was a very lyrical and poetic writer. You brought a bit of her writing to share with us today. Would you like to read it and walk us through why you chose this expert to share?
Sure, Catherine. Thank you. So I thought I would share just, a couple of paragraphs of a speech that Carson delivered in June of 1962. It was the commencement address that she was invited to deliver at Scripps College in Southern California, Women's Liberal Arts College. Ever since the publication of The Sea Around Us 10 years earlier, the president and others at Scripps had been trying to get Carson to get out there. They wanted her to come and visit. It never worked out. She was so busy. And part of why I brought it is because there have been these other moments that we discovered in the archive this year where I've thought that if Carson's life had been longer, I think there would have been a part of her work that may have encompassed the Pacific Ocean and the West Coast, but sadly, her life was cut short. And this particular passage I'll read right now also touches on, among other things, I think something that I had never quite realized about Carson and Silent Spring until this project, which is just how much she was, in addition to everything else she was doing, offering a critique of modern mass consumer society and really raising fundamental questions about what we value most in the world. So I'll begin this passage where she's just kind of made some references in her speech to John Muir, the 19th century conservationist, and she picks up and she says, "But I'm not certain that in spite of all our modern learning and sophistication, we have actually progressed far beyond the self-oriented philosophy of the Victorians. I feel that these ideas still lurk about, showing themselves boldly and openly at times, at others skulking about in the shadows of the subconscious. I have met them frequently as I have pointed out some exquisite creature of the tide pools to a chance companion. What is it for, he may ask, and he is obviously disappointed if I can't assure him that it can be eaten or at least made into some babble to be sold in a shop. But how is one to assign a value to the exquisite, flower-like hydroids reflected in the still mirror of a tide pool? Who can place in one pan of some cosmic scales the trinkets of modern civilization, and in the other the song of a thrush in the windless twilight?"
Well, thank you so much for sharing that with us. Gonna have to look for the full speech. And Carla, you also brought a bit of Rachel Carson's words with you. What would you like to share with us?
So I'd like to share a passage that we feature in the exhibit. It's the last chapter of The Edge of the Sea, which is the third book in the Sea trilogy, which is dedicated to Dorothy and Stanley Freeman. And it's the passage that Carson wanted people to remember her by. It's what she asked to be read at her funeral. And it's a kind of very lyrical passage, and it sort of states her philosophy on the ocean. So I'm going to read a little bit from that. Now I hear the sea sounds about me. The night high tide is rising, swirling with a confused rush of waters against the rocks below my study window. Then in my thoughts, these shores, so different in their nature and in the inhabitants they support, are made one by the unifying touch of the sea. For the differences I sense in this particular instant of time that is mine are but the differences of a moment, determined by our place in the stream of time and in the long rhythms of the sea. Once this rocky coast beneath me was a plain of sand. Then the sea rose and found a new shoreline. And again, in some shadowy future, the surf will have aground these rocks to sand and will have returned the coast to its earlier state. And so in my mind's eye, these coastal forms merge and blend in a shifting, kaleidoscopic pattern in which there is no finality, no ultimate and fixed reality, Earth becoming fluid as the sea itself.
Well, clearly examples of the very lyrical writing that Rachel Carson has. Thank you so much for sharing that, Carla. I think we're certainly inspired to check out the exhibit and read more of her works. You've been listening to librarians and curators for Beinecke Library's exhibition, Silent Springs, Windswept Seas, Rachel Carson's Environmental Vision. Carla Baditz, thank you so much for joining the show today.
Okay. Thank you.
And also James Casanides, thank you so much for coming on the show today as well.
Thank you.
And the show will continue after a quick break. This is Where We Live. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we've been talking about an exhibit at Yale's Beinecke Library showcasing the life of environmentalist Rachel Carson. And the questions Carson raised haven't disappeared. She sounded the alarm on a synthetic pesticide called DDT. But how much evidence is enough before we act to ban chemicals from widespread use? How do we weigh the benefits of a chemical against potential risks? Today, many of those questions are being asked about per- and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. That's another family of chemicals found in drinking water, consumer products, and industrial sites across the country, including right here in Connecticut. Joining me now is Vasilis Vassiliou, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Health Science at the Yale School of Public Health. Vasilis, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for including me in these wonderful discussions.
Well, and so for listeners who are unfamiliar with PFAS, which we've mentioned a couple times now, what are they and why were they used so widely?
Well, PFAS, it stands for per or polyfluoroalkyl substances. Essentially, they're a family of 1,000 synthetic chemicals that they repel water, grease, and heat. That's why they have been used on non-stick cookware, waterproof clothing, firefighting foams, food packaging, and many industrial processes. And the problem is that the PFAS, these compounds, these chemical compounds, break down extremely slow, and they can persist in the environment and in our body and accumulate over time.
And is that one of the reasons why these chemicals have become such a major public health concern, is because they take a long time to break down, so we may not even know we have them in our bodies?
Yes. And essentially, for example, if we go back in the early 40s when these compounds were created. So essentially what it is organic molecules where hydrogen atoms have been replaced by fluorine. And this carbon-fluorine bond, it's impossible to break it. So that's why they're so persistent. Just one of the what we call the C8, the 8 carbon compounds, they have a half-life about 7 to 8 years, which means, it takes about 7 years to dispose 50% of what you have in your body. So as you can see, you can be exposed every day and you can really accumulate that. Very resistant to degradation.
And so before the show, we had reached out to Connecticut's Department of Public Health Commissioner Manisha Jutani, and she said PFAS in drinking water is a dangerous and solvable problem, and Connecticut is taking it seriously. Through proactive testing and a statewide education campaign in partnership with Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, the Connecticut Department of Public Health is working to give every resident the information and resources they need to protect their health. We're committed to transparency, action, and results. So, Vasilis, I know you mentioned just now that PFAS is particularly difficult to manage. What is it about PFAS compared to maybe other contaminants that makes it more difficult for us to either sort of break down or for the environment to break down?
Well, first of all, as I mentioned, this is very stable compounds and very difficult to break down. So this is one of the reason. The second reason is we have been talking about Rachel's book and DTT and awareness and everything. You're talking for one particular chemical. For the PFAS, you're talking for about 14,500 chemicals, different chemicals. So you're not talking for one chemical, but you're talking for a big number of. So in addition to the stability of these compounds, you also have a big number of these compounds. And that's what makes it different.
Well, you mentioned Rachel Carson just now. We've been spending the hour talking about the environmentalist, and previously she has sounded the alarm about the health risk associated with DDT. What are some of the parallels between the DDT debate then versus today's PFAS debate that you're seeing?
Well, there are there are similarities, but the major thing is just like TDD, the PFAS reminds us that chemicals should be evaluated throughout their life cycle and not only after widespread exposure occurs. So we really need to evaluate of what it is happening, and we have to look at the history and everything. And you're talking about environmentalists. Last spring, I hosted the showing of How to Poison a Planet. This is a documentary that has been created by an Australian company. And, you have Robert Below, who is unfortunately couldn't join us today, and Mark Ruffalo, that they're going over about these chemicals throughout the world.
And you mentioned that it takes a while to figure out whether or not chemicals are harmful. Why does society so often discover the downsides of chemicals years after they've become sort of normal or more commonplace? And do you think we've learned from history?
Well, that's $1 million question. Well, the thing is, initially, some of these chemicals, the company is supposed to have a safety. They have to check the safety of these compounds. And in this particular case, the big companies, the 3M and DuPont, I think at the beginning they kept secret the results on the toxicity of these compounds. So, as I said, they were very widespread throughout the world, actually, and then we figure out of what was going on. This in very early 2000s, there was this big epidemiological study on the PFAS in the areas nearby the industrial sites of 3M and DuPont, and they figure out that indeed the PFAS can cause major problems in there.
Well, and here's another big question is, should average residents be worried about everyday exposure?
Well, let me tell you something. We're here to educate people. We're not here to frighten people. So what we would like for people is to understand what it is. So, for example, if we can measure our bloods today, we're going to find some measurable levels of PFAS. Why? Because it's in everyday's life. To what extent they can accumulate is, it's something that we can discuss. However, what we can teach people is how to avoid exposure on this and how to, to stay on the healthy side of the lifestyle. So this is, again, we do not need to panic population, as you mentioned very well, and I do support that. DEEP and DPH and DEEP, the Public Health and the Department of Environmental Protections, especially in Connecticut, they're taking very good care of it in terms of filtering the water, informing the people, and this is essentially what we need to do.
Well, you mentioned some lifestyle advice. What are some practical steps or guidance can people take to reduce exposure?
Well, this is quite a few things. First of all, avoiding using the non-sticks. As again, I remember I was with Rosa DeLuro when she started the campaign about removing PFAS from the boxes for the food boxes packaging. And now, there are not only our state, but many states have prohibited the use of PFAS in food packaging. So those are some of the measures, and this is why we need to inform the people. For example, the carpeting, the dusts from the carpeting, that we have the fire foam for that we use for uh, taking the fires off is another possible way of contaminating. So it's very simple, and as you mentioned earlier, both DPH and DIP are doing an amazing job informing the public of our state.
Well, and as conversation about PFAS is more at the forefront for people and there's more, the stories and headlines about it, are there warning labels on items containing PFAS? Is that something that people should look for when they're purchasing cosmetics or cookware or different everyday items?
That's an outstanding question. It is funny because about 4 or 5 months ago, I was asked, there is this thing about alcohol and cancer, and there is a tendency to put labeling into the alcohol that alcohol causes cancer, just similar to what we have with cigarette smoke and everything. And I said, absolutely yes. But the thing is, we need to extend this kind of warning with everything else. So, for example, something that people don't even pay attention is sugar, right? Sugar causes obesity, can cause diabetes. And of course, for the PFAS, yes, they have to be some labels, at least indicating that this product may have PFAS, or at least they have PFAS. And I can tell you there is so much going on right now with the industry and the way that they try to advertise various products, and they call it PFOA and PFOS free, which means they can have another 14,498 PFAS in that product that, they don't mention it. So yes, they should have a mention of what the product does have. And, because if you know that your carpet has PFAS and then this dust eventually will come in the air and then you can inhale it, this is going to be a problem. But if you know that, you can take your measures.
Well, and then sort of building on that, there is some policy that will reduce the average American's exposure. So, for example, public water systems are required to reduce PFAS in water by 2029 or by 2031 under an extension proposed by the Trump administration. Is that something that gives you hope? Should we look out for that in the future?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Putting regulatory limits is very important. Remember, many years ago, the EPA was not taking the lead going into the regulation, and the states had to go through and set up their own limits. And actually, Governor Lamont here had put the PFAS action, the call for the PFAS action, and that generated a lot of collaboration between the DPH and universities in the states, and we were reached some regulatory limits for the state. But now, you can see that things are moving in terms of putting the regulation in the drinking water. And if you make it on a federal regulation, it's much different. The one thing, though, that I need to warn people is, public waters you can monitor very well. What happens is, the problem is with wells, the private wells. The private wells are not regulated by neither state or federal government, and these people at least should be aware of checking their water.
Well, thank you so much for the guidance. We'll certainly be looking out for that. You've been listening to Vasilis Vassiliou, who's a professor and chair of the Department of Environmental Health Science at the Yale School of Public Health. Vasilis, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for having me.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Chloe Wynn. Our technical producer is Jean Amatruda. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. And thank you all so much for listening.